Okay, so this is our Simondon reading group, continuing our discussion of Individuation, Volume 2, and we're still reading History of the Notion of the Individual within that volume. So last week we saw the sort of post-Socratic philosophers, the Megarian school and the Cynics, so Simondon analyzes some of the sophisms, or these sort of arguments that are kind of paradoxes, or lead to these invalid arguments that lead to these paradoxical conclusions. So the Sorites paradox, which has to do with vague terms or terms that involve some sort of continuity. So the primary example is the notion of a heap. So a heap of grain, if you remove one grain from it, it's still a heap, and if you remove another grain, it's still a heap, and if you keep removing one grain at a time, eventually you're left with just one grain, which should still be a heap if removing one grain from a heap doesn't change its heapness. And so this type of argument was sort of characteristic of some of these post-Socratic schools. And they also, on the ethical side, tended to be kind of individualists, in the sense that they were not interested in the political life of the Greek city-state. They were oriented towards, they had this idea of sort of liberating the individual from social conventions, which are treated as something that constrain the individual. And so that's sort of the general orientation of the post-Socratic philosophers, with variations depending on the different schools that arose. And then Simondon makes a transition to another sort of period in the history of the ancient world, when you see with Alexander the Great and the sort of post-Alexander kingdoms, you have, instead of having these independent city-states, you now have these large empires or kingdoms that incorporate multiple cities, multiple different linguistic groups or peoples, religions, constitutions, and so on. And there's this constant change going on within these empires and kingdoms, where you have different dynasties take over, and one kingdom conquers another, and so on. And so this sort of social environment, Simondon argues, is sort of conducive to understanding the individual in dynamic terms as opposed to static terms. Instead of trying to understand what an individual is in terms of its incorporation into an order of simultaneity, we instead want to understand the individual in accordance with its insertion into an order of succession or of becoming. And so we want to understand what is it that unifies an individual for its lifespan, or of its history, or whatever we want to use. And so that transition leads to the Stoics. The Stoics were one of the major schools of the Hellenistic and Roman period. They develop an ethics that has to do with sort of acceptance of destiny, or of Providence is another term that they use. So they understand the universe as being sort of organized in accordance with a divine plan, or providence, or order of some kind. And wisdom, or the ethical life, consists in inserting yourself into that order and sort of accepting that order, and not trying to change it. But at the same time, there's this notion within Stoicism of the cosmopolitanism, which is a term that sort of arises in Stoic philosophy, which the literal meaning of cosmopolitan is an inhabitant of the universe, or someone who sort of whose polis, whose state is the universe rather than one sort of limited city. And so the Stoics had a sort of alliance, or general favorability towards these emperors and kings and the rulers of all these large states that arise in the Hellenistic and Roman era. They view these large states as being sort of approximations towards a universal order or a universal government, or something along those lines. So they see this cosmopolitanism as being aligned with these large states that incorporate many different peoples. And then Simondon goes into some details about the Stoic physics, which is actually very interesting, I think. So in contrast to the physics of Plato or Aristotle, we have a notion of interpenetration of bodies, and mixtures. So the sort of stock example that the Stoics used was, if you pour wine into water, the wine suffuses the water, and every portion of that mixture contains both wine and water. It's not the case that you can sort of separate out particles of wine from particles of water. Every portion, no matter how small, contains both wine and water. And they took this as a sort of model of what the universe is like. So the universe is composed of different bodies that interpenetrate each other. And in particular, there's this pneuma, the breath, which is a sort of principle of action and energy in the universe, which sort of uses everything and makes it active, and puts it into motion. And we'll see more about the relationship between this physics and the notion of the individual today. Let's see if there's anything else to mention before we start. Yeah, okay, let's start. So yeah, Angus, if you want to read.
Each singular body, therefore, owes its individuality neither to its internal geometric structure nor to its place in the order of simultaneity of beings, but instead to the proper mixture that characterizes it. It is idiosyncrasy in the proper sense of the term, the temporal series of the influences, also in the proper sense that it has undergone, is within it as constitutive of its idiosyncrasy. Its entire past existence is really contained in it materially, or at least corporeally. To know what a singular being is, one must know the series of the successive instants of its existence in time, or at least the drama of the successive passions that have influenced it. Since this succession of passions is different for each being, the individuality of a being is constituted by its singularity. There is indeed a proper quality of each being, its idioma, that corresponds to the idiosyncrasy. This proper and somewhat personal quality always distinguishes one being from every other. This quality is what allows fantasia to be fantasia cataleptica, comprehensive representation, i.e., according to Zeno, quote, the representation imprinted in the soul based on a real object and in conformity with this real object, such that it would not exist if it did not come from a real object, unquote. This comprehensive representation produces a true perception with the same necessity that a weight lowers the tray of a scale. Knowledge is this relation of an object which is real and recognized as real due to its individual singularity to a subject that is equally real and individual. In this theory, no matter what may constitute knowledge, relation has the value of being, for it is solely corporeal, and it modifies terms materially. It is not a simple rapport. It is definitively inscribed in the terms by becoming an integral part of their idiosyncrasy. Intellectual elaboration can only consist in the grasping of the sensible object. One can only abstract, add, compose, transpose, while never getting out of sensible givens. The propositions obtained in this way do not express a rapport between concepts. Their subject is always singular, and the attribute is always a verb, i.e., something that happens to the subject. The matter of dialectics consists in the stated facts of singular subjects. The syllogism is a rapport between facts, each of which is expressed by a simple proposition and the rapport of which is expressed by a composite judgment. The logical bond is always expressed as a bond observed between facts and stated by language. This notion of fact, which governs the entirety of Stoic philosophy, is extremely important for the conception of the individual. The individual is the being that results from a series of facts organized into a drama. There is no longer a distinction between substance and accidents in the individual. The being is what it is, or rather, it is what it has been. The fact of being what it was no longer refers to a permanent quiddity, but to the novelty of an indefinite.
Right, so here we have some sort of sketch of some of the Stoic logical doctrines, which are also pretty interesting, which have some differences from Aristotle's doctrine and some of the logical terms that we use today. So if you take a sort of intro logic course, you'll learn about modus ponens, which is the inference, if A then B, A therefore B. This is sort of the basic rule that any logical system more or less has to include. This term modus ponens comes from Stoic logic, and so the Stoic logic has a relationship to the logic, and the physics and the epistemology are all sort of intertwined with each other because it's a logical system of that involves the knowledge of individuals in a way that Aristotle's is not. So Aristotle's logical system, you're always inferring things about all. You have propositions like all men are mortal, which has to do with men in general, and those are the types of propositions that you are reasoning about in Aristotelian logic. But in Stoic logic, you have this more sort of individual reasoning process, and this is connected with the epistemology because there's this notion of knowledge as a real relationship between entities, so between the knowing subject and the object known, and so there's this fantasia, this image of the object, which is an effect of the object on the subject, and there's a sort of a real process that occurs in which the subject comes to have this fantasia, and this is also connected with the way that for the Stoics, the individual is sort of made up of the history of that individual, and this applies to human individuals, but also to physical objects or whatever. Rather than having something like a substance in which various properties inhere, like in the Aristotelian physics, we instead have an individual made up of a series of events. So things happen to an individual, or the individual does things. These are events, and they sort of string together to make up the life history of this individual. And so there's no sort of underlying subject in which all the properties are, and the properties come to inhere or disappear from the subject. It's always just these series of events that are linked together, and in particular also in connection with epistemology and logic. The Stoics hold that knowledge is always, or intellectual activity in general, is always sort of operating on the sensible, on these fantasiae. So you never, as opposed to the Aristotelian doctrine, which involves something like abstraction from the sensible. So you see a tree and you see another tree, and then you abstract from the what is you sort of grasp what is common to the two trees, and then you have the concept of tree. That's the sort of Aristotelian picture. Whereas for the Stoics, you're always sort of operating on sensible images in various ways. You add them together, or you mix them, or whatever. You do things to them, and that's what knowledge or thinking or intellectual activity in general consists in.
I don't want to take us too far afield, but I don't totally understand how the individual can be conceived as like a series of events. I don't really get what distinguishes an event that happens to or that composes one individual versus an event that happens to or composes another, if there's nothing to which the event happens.
So we can think of it as this sort of, so the big picture is that there's really only just one individual, which is the universe. The universe is the only true individual in the sense that it is something sort of self-subsistent and that doesn't depend on everything else. Doesn't depend on anything else. So within the universe, the bodies that we call, human bodies or stones or horses or whatever, these are sort of quasi-individuals. They have a certain continuity of existence. So a horse from one instant to the next doesn't suddenly become a dog or a stone or whatever. There's a continuity of existence from one moment to the next in the life history of the horse. But this continuity is sort of is a sort of continuity over an ongoing process. So the horse, as this individual horse, is just a sort of one chain of events that occur throughout, from conception to death of this horse. It's just this continuous series of transformations and invariance of those transformations that occurs over the course of time. And so there's a difference in kind between the individuality of the universe, which is a full individuality, and then the individuality of bodies within the universe, which is only a sort of partial individuality, because bodies always interpenetrate each other and transform each other.
Okay, thank you. That kind of makes sense.
And so this, it's a very different doctrine than the Aristotelian doctrine, which is more sort of common sense based, I suppose, where you think of objects as entities that subsist through time, and then properties as inhering in objects, and being, an object can gain or lose properties while remaining the object it is. And so this is a sort of common sense conception that Aristotle systematizes. And then the Stoic conception, on the other hand, is a much more revisionary conception. So it sort of wants to transform our conception of the world and propose a different model in which it's this incorporation into the universe, which is sort of the what defines individuals. So how they interact with other entities and how they undergo transformations over time is what defines an individual. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. Let's see, where did we end? I think you read the sentence, the individual is the being that is constituted, etc. I think you ended there, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
No, sorry, the next one.
Yes.
Maybe it's let's start from there and we'll
No, you're right.
Go from there. Okay. The individual is the being that is constituted by a singular drama and accumulates within itself, in its idiosyncrasy, the substance of all these events, all these relations that transform into being because they are corporeal. Facts are all that exist, and the individual is not merely the result, but the corporeal product of a series of facts. It is like time condensed in a body. In this vision of the world, relation is an exchange of being, a contribution of being, a total mixture. At any rate, the notion of substance in the Hellenic sense is destroyed, since every accident contributes substance, which is incorporated into already existing substance by mixing with it. Spiritualism and materialism coincide in this doctrine because the total mixture can be considered as a type of relation that is valid both for two matters as for a matter and a spiritual principle. The relation between a passive body and an active body prefigures that of a soul and a body, whether the soul be conceived as corporeal or incorporeal. Its role is in fact that of activity, which expands throughout due to the total mixture, and not that of a passivity, which is relegated to the body. This theory turns the individual into a fact or a result of a series of facts. It gives the individual an absolute singularity, but takes away from it its return to itself as an active capacity of creating itself and defining itself. The individual becomes the subject of states rather than acts. Its activity is a result of relation rather than an initiative. For the individual is only alive to the extent that it can still accommodate other facts and events that will mix new inputs with its substance. It is perpetually itself and other than itself, whence results in ethics a sort of splitting of the being relative to itself. There is the individual qua singularity, and there is also what happens to the individual. Nevertheless, the individual is indeed formed by the ensemble of what has happened to it, but a sort of privilege of interiority is created in favor of what has already happened in the past, and thereby forms part of the individual. Thus, to found ethical theory, the Stoic is forced to introduce a blunt distinction between the things that depend on us and those that do not. Ta ephemin, ta uk ephemin. However, this distinction is fake because in the cosmos, everything is in everything, and everything is linked together. Universal unity is broken for the needs of action. What must be designated are limits, artificial ones if necessary, to the de jure individual, the individual who will accept becoming responsible for himself. This de jure individual consequently becomes distinct from de facto individuality, which is singular and always in becoming. Person, the mask that creates a stability of the role, appears over the individual and transforms the temporal series into a rapport of simultaneity between different roles constituting the drama. The word drama itself has a double meaning. This is because drama, for the spectator who is not forewarned, is at every moment something new in the appearance of peripateas. But the protagonist, and especially for the author, this order is in fact an order of simultaneity. Necessity reappears at the heart of becoming. Furthermore, the Stoic theory, if only due to this distinction between what depends on us and what does not depend on us, introduces the notion of adiaphora, indifferent terms of action which are neither good nor bad and which do not allow for a motivated decision. I'll stop here because this is a multi-page paragraph. Right, so this is sort of continuing what we were talking about a little bit earlier about this notion of the individual as being sort of only a quasi-individual. So the individual is incorporated into the universe and undergoes transformation and is subject to influences arising from without, from other bodies, and really, not even influences is the right term because other bodies penetrate any given body. All bodies are intermingled with each other, and this mixture is what sort of constitutes the life history of that individual. What is sort of a difficulty for Stoicism is then to extract an ethical theory from this doctrine of the individual as sort of arising from the mixture of states and this chain of events that constitute an individual, because in their ethical theory they want to make this strict distinction between what depends on me and what does not depend on me, and so what I can be responsible for and what I can control is what depends on me, and then what I can't control and what I can't be held responsible for is what does not depend on me. And ethical life should be oriented towards taking charge of what depends on me and sort of ignoring or not concerning oneself with things that don't depend on me. So I shouldn't worry about receiving honors or being famous or receiving the approval of others, because all those things don't depend on me. What I should worry about is sort of cultivating my own virtue and my own sort of inner qualities in a way that doesn't depend on others. But if you compare this ethical doctrine to the physical doctrine, then it's sort of hard to figure out how you can make this strict distinction between what depends on me and what does not depend on me, because in the physical sense, everything sort of depends on everything else. Everything is interpenetrating and transforming each other. So there's this difficulty of how we can provide a physical basis for the ethical distinction between what depends on me and what does not depend on me. And so Simondon suggests here that what is sort of lacking in the Stoic doctrine of the individual is something like a notion of recurrence or self-reference or self-regulation or something along those lines. So we've seen in volume 1 of this book the importance of these kinds of notions to his understanding of the individual. But so in the Stoic conception of the individual, there's nothing like a self-orientation or self-regulation of the individual. The individual is just subject to a series of transformations, and wisdom just consists in sort of accepting those transformations as they happen, and there's no sort of sense in which the individual is sort of meant to take charge of their own destiny or to make decisions and orient themselves in various ways and so on. And then the next important concept that Simondon brings in here is this notion of a persona or a role. And this was the persona was an important Stoic concept. And the literal meaning of persona is a mask, like the mask that an actor wears in Greek drama. And so your social role or your insertion into the social order is conceived as a kind of mask that you wear, and so you put on a certain role and you play this role in relation to others that are playing different roles, and you have to understand. So Simondon argues that we have to understand this persona or this role as something in the order of simultaneity as opposed to the order of succession. So for the spectator of a play or of a drama of some kind, the events sort of happen in succession, and you don't necessarily know what's coming next. And so the organization of the drama is one in the order of succession. But for the author of the drama, there's this order of simultaneity. So the author organizes the drama as a whole and not sort of just as a sequence of events that happen to different personas or something along those lines. So this notion of the persona kind of nullifies to some extent the notion of the individual as this sequence of events and something constituted in the order of becoming. It sort of reinserts the individual into the order of simultaneity. That's what Simondon is arguing here. Okay, so let's continue from instead of being the rigorous ordering.
Instead of being the rigorous ordering of becoming, wisdom becomes a state, a sort of fact. The primordial dynamism condemns itself and destroys itself. As soon as Sophos has come to knowledge, to wisdom, it is syntonic relative to becoming, and this harmony no longer ceases. It is united by will with respect to the cosmos, which it accepts and desires. It wills what happens. But this state of syntony cannot be attained incrementally according to a progress in time. Harmony is effectuated in a single stroke. The faulos, the mediocre, who are not taught enough to be able to resonate with the rhythm of the universe, never make it to wisdom. There are no degrees in the acquisition of wisdom. Just as pups who have never seen the light of day would never know what light was if they died before opening their eyes, and just as the swimmer who is sinking but almost reaches the surface also drowns just as fatally whether a foot or 20 fathoms below, The man who has not realized within himself the appropriate tension for resonating with the rhythm of the universe remains as much a miserable wretch as he would have been if he had never made any effort. Merit and progress do not exist for the individual in this philosophy, which assimilates wisdom to a state, a degree of mental tension. While this theory should lead to an affirmation of the continuous, ethics is concentrated in an affirmation of the essential discontinuity of ethical states and an inexorable law of all or nothing. Ethics does not perfectly agree with physics, for which, quote, movement in each of its instances is an act and not just a passage to the act, unquote. The internal difficulty of Stoicism precisely depends on this omnipotence of fact, which evokes the thought of the Bible. The individual being does not find within himself the reason for his successive states because he is what happens to him. What happens to him is incorporated into his being. There is no return of the being's causality to himself. This pure singularity is split with respect to itself. The individual can act upon himself and contemplate himself only with respect to the mask of the role. The recurrence of causality occurs by way of an exterior path, a path which the being cannot create, but which is given to him. The being is not the one who gives value to it. It is given to him as already laden with value. This individual is far removed from the substantiality and aseity of prominity in being. It is easy to understand how this doctrine for quite some time was able to encounter and accompany the doctrines of Eastern Christianity. It is also easy to understand how Stoicism became the quintessential civic doctrine. The city needs the valorization of a fact. It also needs the formalism of the role. The notion of the pure and the impure, the chosen and the damned, the state of sin and the state of grace is based on the interiority of the fact qua state to the exteriority of ritual formalism. Yet for the Stoics, there can be no formalism, properly speaking. Every relation and consequently every action and therefore every gesture involves corporeal reality. A gesture is never a pure symbol. The gesture modifies what it achieves. Transubstantiation is conceivable in Stoicism precisely because the idea of substance has disappeared, or at least has become quite different from what it was in Platonic geometrism, or Aristotle's thought. Similarly, the civic form of Latin Stoicism can be understood as a consequence of this real nature of relation. The mask of the role is as real as the face of the individual who bears it. This profound ambiguity of Stoicism is due to the fact that the individual is a singular being, but not a substance. All the efforts to define individual reality based on Stoic thought are burdened with this fundamental difficulty. For the individual to accomplish his fulfillment, the succession of his acts and states must be rigorously ordered. But this temporal order has to occur definitively with respect to an exterior reality, i.e., the world. Thus, a theory of time that encapsulates the succession of instants in a definite form must be created. The future itself must be part of this necessity of time. Succession becomes an uncoiling, and the life of the individual is fully contained within itself. Each being lives its destiny, and destiny is quasi rudentis explicatio, like the uncoiling of a cable around a capstan when sailors set out to sea. The knots, stains, accidents of the cable do appear when the cable uncoils. They were already contained and predetermined in the spirals coiled around the capstan. A certain artificiality remains in this life of the persona. Something remains unsatisfied in the human being, who cannot be fully accepted as a given. The singularity of the individual is saved by the Stoics, but to the detriment of substantiality. I thought this point about the distinction between the pure and the impure and the fact of the state and ritual formalism was interesting, but I didn't totally follow what he was saying there.
Yeah, so there's maybe I'll just start by mentioning there's a slight translation modification that I would make here. So when in the translation here it says the doctrines of Eastern Christianity, I think a better translation would be what there is, the doctrines. No, it doesn't actually say doctrines. It says what there is in Christianity that is an Oriental import. And the idea here is that within Christianity, there's something. There's the famous line, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. There's a certain submission to the existing order in Christianity, in the same way as there is in Stoicism, that you sort of insert yourself into this order, and you don't sort of try to change that order. You just play your role within the order. And so Stoicism in sort of the later Roman era, there was a kind of class division between Christianity as the lower class religion, and then Stoicism as sort of the replacement for religion among the higher classes. And they both have this insertion into the social order in the way that they sort of accept the fact of rule of the monarch or whoever is in charge of the state. And there's also this what here Simondon calls the formalism of the role. So this idea that the role sort of precedes the individual who plays it, or is in a sense independent of the individual who plays it. So your role as emperor or slave or whatever is sort of indifferent to who actually occupies that role. So the social order, so Simondon was arguing here that the city or the state requires both this valorization of a fact, so this acceptance of the existing social order, and also this formalism of the role, so this sort of priority of the role over or indifference of the role to who occupies it. And Stoicism provides both of those things, and so this is sort of an explanation of why it becomes a civic doctrine, in the sense that it becomes sort of the quasi-official doctrine of the ruling classes in the Roman Empire. But then he argues that there's a certain this formalism of the role in Stoicism contradicts to some extent the Stoic physics, because in the Stoic physics everything has to do with the interpenetration of bodies, and so there's nothing like a form in the Stoic physics, so it's hard to understand what status these roles have. If these roles or personas are real, then they should be bodies that interpenetrate with other bodies. And so there's a certain tension between these two aspects of the Stoic doctrine. And then another point here is, well, maybe 2 points. So going back a little bit earlier to this idea that the wise person, the sophos, they are there's a sort of all or nothing property to wisdom. It's not like you can sort of seek wisdom and gain more and more wisdom and sort of perfect your wisdom over a lifespan. It's something that happens at a particular moment or not. And we can compare this in some sense to certain Buddhist doctrines of enlightenment, of how someone is sort of suddenly struck by like in Zen Buddhism especially, you have someone suddenly achieves enlightenment after hearing a koan, or some sort of sudden event brings about enlightenment. And again, enlightenment here is understood as something that either happens or doesn't happen. And so for the Stoics, there isn't a sense in which sort of pursuing wisdom is something that implies merit for its own sake. So trying to be wise is not meritorious. It's only actually achieving wisdom that matters. And so they understand this state of wisdom as a state of resonance with the oscillations of the universe. So it's understood in this physical sense. So you, as a body made up of these mixtures of other bodies and this life history of events that happen to you, you manage to achieve this state of resonance, syntania. You resonate with the universe, and so you are sort of accepting your insertion into the universe, and this is and as we saw last they argue that this is a sort of reconciliation of freedom and determinism, because you as an individual have your sort of internal resonance. You are sort of in charge of yourself as when you achieve wisdom, but you do so by resonating in harmony with the frequency of the universe, and so wisdom consists precisely in accepting your destiny, and sort of acting in accordance with your destiny. And that's the second point that I wanted to bring up, is that last bit of this paragraph. Yeah, it's all vibrations. That's right. And that's, I mean, that is exactly right. Their physics has to do with vibrations and resonance of different frequencies with each other. So it is funny that has become a sort of new age idea that is prominent today. I don't know if there's any sort of historical connection between those two, or if it's just a coincidence that they ended up sharing the same kind of general picture. But yeah, the second point that I wanted to bring up is this notion of this image of a life history as the uncoiling of a cable, where everything that happens in that life history, or all the different sort of events that happen as you uncoil that cable, are all sort of already there in the cable as it's coiled up. So your entire life history is part of this destiny that is already present before you were born, just in the way that the universe is structured. And so for the Stoics, there's this notion of divine providence. So everything is sort of ordered in such a way that everything is ordered in accordance with an end. But Simoneau argues that this notion of destiny sort of leaves aside one aspect of what we understand in ourselves, as we understand ourselves as individuals. So he says the Stoics save the singularity of the individual. They have this notion of the individual as this life history that is unique and singular. But what they don't have is a way of capturing the substantiality of the individual. So the way that the individual is sort of responsible for itself, or capable of orienting itself towards a goal, and selecting a goal to which to be oriented. And so this notion of the destiny, or the cable uncoiling, is a complete rejection of anything like that doctrine, a rejection of the idea of having any sort of control over one's own destiny. So there's this rejection of this notion of substantiality. Okay, so let's go on to the Epicurean. We'll just be able to start, because I don't have time to continue the full section on the Epicureans, but yeah, we'll start the Epicureans today, and then we'll see how far we get.
Okay. The Epicureans. Epicureanism is in a certain sense is the contrary of Stoicism. But in fact, it stems from the same desire to discover a meaning in individual reality and to unleash it from the order of the simultaneous. Epicureanism is also a philosophy that seeks to discover in the being a consistency that is independent from every actual relation. But the path of the search is inverted. Instead of considering the temporal series as vaster than the human individual, who is integrated into it like an episodic role is integrated into a vast drama, the Epicureans considered temporal genesis as involving a level quite inferior to that of the human individual. The individual is a relative being, as with the Stoics. It is not a veritable substance by itself. But with the Epicureans, it is a composite. It is a composite, whereas with the Stoics, it was a component grasped in the becoming of the macrocosm. For the Stoics, veritable substantiality is quite above the human individual, whereas for the Epicureans, it is quite below. In both doctrines, the individual being remains on a level that is not the level of veritable substantiality. In the Epicurean Doctrine, the atoms are what is eternal, just as in the Stoics, the macrocosm is what is eternally reborn in the rhythm of the return of the great year. Undoubtedly, unlike in Stoicism, individualities are not the inexplicable idios poion, which is a fragmentation of the primitive fire. And individual destinies do not depend on celestial influences. There is no privileged moment in individual becoming, no moment in which the becoming of the individual is inserted into the vaster becoming of the cosmos through the privileged occasion, the kairos. The Epicurean individual is apart, like a world isolated from another world in the infinity of space. It is the composite being that seeks to flee from relation to conserve a precarious impenetrability that is constantly threatened. The defensive attitude of the Epicureans involves saving the instant and preserving the short moment of duration that the life of the individual is, not allowing it to be traversed and dilapidated by inessential relations, the results of illusions and error or fear, which makes man blind. Unlike the Stoics, the Epicureans are not those who think a new world and establish the monarchy of reason parallel with the political monarchy in its goal of conquering and unifying the world. Cosmopolitanism is not what animates the thought of Epicurus. The society that he found is quite limited. It is a little circle wherein everyone knows everyone else individually and can isolate themselves from the city and remain independent from the great monarchic enterprise undertaken by the Stoics. Alexander's hostility, which will force Epicurus to leave Athens for several years, shows that the society of philosophers was really quite independent from the vast political enterprise. I think the way that the ethics of the Epicureans and the Stoics follow from their physics is impressive and interesting. The kind of defensiveness of the Epicurean atomism leads them to be less like integrable, I guess, into Hellenistic society.
The integration of the ethics and the physics is something that is really, I think you're right to call it impressive, because there's a real effort at systematization in both the Stoics and the Epicureans. They want to have a consistent understanding of the world. They want their physics and their ethics to be consistent with each other. But they go about it in completely opposite ways, even though at the level of sort of concrete ethical doctrines, there's actually a fair amount of, overlap or accordance between the two. So they Epicureans and the Stoics, they sort of give similar prescriptions for how you should live your life, but they come about it from a completely opposite direction. So Simondon sets out the contrast here between the two. The Stoics have a physics and an understanding of the world in terms of the integration of the human being into an order that is much greater or much larger than they are. Whereas the Epicureans have a doctrine of the composition of the individual. So the individual human being is a composite out of the true individuals, which are the atoms. And the Epicurean doctrine was sort of less conducive to becoming a civic doctrine in the Hellenistic and the Roman era compared to the Stoic doctrine. Because the Epicurean doctrine is a sort of critical doctrine. It tends to, so in the case, we'll see this more when we get to Lucretius, but in the case of religion, the Epicureans argue that all of the doctrines of the gods having passions and interest in human affairs and so on are just myths and should be criticized, and we can only conceive of the gods as being indifferent to human affairs. So there's this critical aspect of the Epicurean doctrine which is not present in the Stoic doctrine, and this makes it harder to sort of accept in Hellenistic society, even though the Epicureans are certainly not revolutionaries or sort of opposed to the existing social order, but they sort of withdraw from the order in a way that the Stoics don't. I think we have time for maybe one more reading, and then I'll have to end. One point before I read the next bit was I put in the chat here the definition of kairos. This is a sort of untranslatable term or hard to translate term, but it means a sort of the correct moment for something, or this sort of moment where things line up properly, or where something happens that in the way it was supposed to, or something along those lines. And so in the Stoic doctrine, the wise man achieves wisdom in this moment, the kairos, this privileged occasion is the term that Simondon uses here. So whereas in Epicureanism, there's no sort of instant where the individual becomes incorporated into a whole that is greater than them. Okay, so I'll go on to read the next bit. Epicurean physics is quite different from that of the Stoics and evinces a very different mental attitude in the conception of the individual. For the Stoics, the veritable individual is the world, an organized being whose different parts present a finality that binds them together in the dynamic unity of the whole. The source of the dynamism is in the reality of the whole, in the seminal fire or artistic fire that suffuses all things by containing them. There must be an individuality of the whole so that relations between singular individuals can exist within this individuality due to its organization and the dynamic relations in which the fire is involved. The resonance that couples a resonator and an oscillator requires a milieu within which energy can propagate. According to the Stoics, energy propagates like a packet of fire that animates the whole, much more than a coupling of two identical oscillators wherein each can be an oscillator or a resonator at any moment. The Stoics saw in resonance the example of a relation between a milieu, which is vast and animated by the soul of the whole, and a singular being within this milieu. The milieu dominates the singular being as though the latter were suspended in the former, inundated by it. The singular individual is in a state of energetic inferiority and spatial subjection relative to the milieu. At any rate, the milieu is not limited. Its indefinite nature makes it the depository of dynamism, and this self-return, this causal circularity that confers upon a being its autonomy and veritable individuality. The milieu is not the whole qua sum of all existing bodies, but the whole as active energy of the whole as unity of circulation communicating within itself, which is the veritable physical individual in the theory of the Stoics. In relation with the dynamic milieu, the singular individual does not itself possess a dynamism, except insofar as it receives a packet of this igneous energy that animates the dynamic milieu. One question that is difficult to fully clarify nevertheless remains. Is this dynamic milieu inert by itself, a simple vehicle which transmits the energy of the world soul to singular individuals, or instead is it the source of activity itself, the soul properly speaking? It seems that it plays both roles at the same time, and this is why the situation of the singular individual in the milieu, which not only attaches it to the whole, but also constitutes the activity of the whole, remains ambivalent. I'll stop there for now. Hopefully we got all of that. There might have been some connection issues. So here Simondon is sort of contrasting again the Stoic physics and the Epicurean physics. So he starts by depicting the Stoic physics as one in which there's this strong notion of the influence of the milieu on the individual, and so we talked about this earlier when we were reading the part on the Stoics. So the individual is always penetrated by the environment and is only a sort of quasi-individual in that sense. There's always there's this continuity of the Stoic physics in the sense that there's no void. Everything is full. The universe is a full plenitude. And this fire, the sort of energy of the universe penetrates everything and brings about transformations in everything. And then we'll see as we get to the next bit that the Epicurean physics, by contrast, is a physics of atoms and the void. So the atoms only interact by contact with each other. So one atom strikes another one and joins together with it, or makes it deviate from its path, and so on. And there's no transmission of energy or influence through the void. It's only by contact that atoms interact with each other. And so we'll see next time what Simondon argues is the effect of this doctrine of atomism on the notion of the individual for Epicurean physics.
If you still have a couple of minutes, I have been reading this book on like the history of individuation in the early modern period, and it talks about like I read the chapter on Descartes and the chapter on Spinoza, and it talked about, for instance, in Spinoza, the individuals or bodies being a fixed ratio of like motion and rest, whereas for Simondon, he always seems to reduce the individual in Spinoza to kind of substance itself. And I wonder if maybe that's not like the most charitable approach to, to say that kind of the Stoics only have the individual of the cosmos because the individuals like stones and horses and men are somehow subordinated to the individuality of the cosmos. Whether you can have a notion of an individual even if you have like one large substance or lots of smaller substances. But that's probably required like a longer discussion than we have time
maybe
for.
We can come back to that when we get to the part on Spinoza. Because yes, you're right that Simondon treats Spinoza as only having a notion of the individual at the level of the one substance. So the only individual is the one substance, God or nature, that everything is a component of, or a mode of, every finite being is a mode of the one substance. And Spinoza, there's exactly this doctrine of the formation of individuals in accordance with ratios of movement and rest. So an individual body is a certain ratio of movement and rest, which is constant even as those bodies undergo transformations. And actually, I was just reading Martial Guru, his commentary on Spinoza, and he argues that the model for this doctrine in Spinoza is precisely oscillating pendulums. There's the idea that this ratio of movement and rest is a kind of oscillation of bodies, because each pendulum has its own fixed ratio at which it oscillates. And likewise, there's this sort of fixed ratio of vibration or oscillation of the bodies that make up an individual in Spinoza. So there's connections with the Stoic doctrine there that I hadn't really thought of before. But yeah, so I think Simondon always wants to have, I think, a univocal notion of the individual. So a notion of the individual that applies to all individuals in the same way. Whereas in Spinoza, or in the Stoics or in other doctrines, certain kinds of individuals have to be understood in one sense or another. So the individuality of the universe is not the same thing as the individuality of a human being or a horse or whatever. And I guess we can argue whether a univocal notion of the individual is important or not. But that's sort of Simondon's general principle. He wants to have a single concept of what the individual is, whereas these other doctrines have multiple concepts of the individual. Okay, so yeah, I have to go, but thanks for coming out, and hopefully next week I should be able to have the full session. So hopefully we should be able to get through the Epicureans and probably the section on Lucretius as well.